very exciting week last week is we finally have a bipartisan permanent reform bill. It is bipartisan, even though Manchin is technically an independent. There will be Democrats on the bill, I can assure you. And I want everybody to give themselves a big pat on the back because we have really been working on this for 2 years now. And all the lobbying meetings, all the webinars, all the talking to volunteers and set up meetings, this is really the inflection point where it's come to fruition. I mean, these are one of these things that so much stuff just transpires behind closed doors now, but it doesn't mean our lobbying meetings, the work we've been doing, the conversations we've been having haven't directly impacted this bill and moved it into existence. And now even to its first vote this week, that quickly. And so, I mean, all that's highly exciting, and we should feel a lot of ownership of the bill and just acknowledge that some of the sausage making that we talk about when we used to talk about a carbon price that we had, our preferred carbon price, and then down the line there would be sausage making. Well, a lot of the sausage making for this bill has already happened. We've been talking about all the things we like and want to see in a permanent reform bill, and a lot of them are in this bill. And then behind the scenes, some of that sausage making to get that compromise, that bipartisan product into the world has happened. And now we really want to get behind it because the good far outweighs any bad. And right now, I'd like to turn it over to Dana, who's been doing a tremendous amount of work with Rick to answer questions in the forums, and you should get a big round of applause for that. But Dana's going to do a brief review of the bill, and then we can get into some of the questions you guys might have.
So yeah, you guys know me, CCL research coordinator, environmental scientist, climate journalist. And we're going to talk about this bill, the Energy Permitting Reform Act, talk about what's in it, who supports it, who opposes it, and why, and roughly what effect will it have on the climate, and why is CCL supporting it. And please bear with me because I threw these slides together in like a day, and so they're a little bit rough. We're going to do another version of this probably in September, which will incorporate any new information we get between now and then, and will probably be better than this one because I'll have more than 24 hours to work on it. We've also got an FAQs document that I'm working on. There's a lot of information to put in there, so I'm doing it as fast as I can, and that will kind of try to answer a lot of the questions you guys have been having in a easier to digest place than that forum discussion that's got like 80 different comments in it now. So let's start by talking about what's in the bill. So it's got lots of good stuff on transmission, which is one of the things we really wanted to see. It's got some stuff on interregional transmission planning, which is similar to the Big Wires Act you guys are familiar with, except it doesn't have any kind of minimum requirements of transferring electricity between regions, but it still does have some good planning in there, planning to transfer electricity between regions of the country. So that's useful. A really important and kind of unexpected thing is that it gives FERC, Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, authority over the permitting of big important interstate transmission lines. We actually weren't expecting to see that in there because up to this point, Republicans didn't seem to like that, and I guess they kind of thought it was okay and decided it was all right to put in here. The way it's happening right now is that first, the Department of Energy has to decide like these regions are national interest corridors, meaning that they're areas of the country that are really important to put transmission lines. So they first have to make that designation, and then it goes over to FERC, and then FERC can deal with the permitting of transmission lines in those national interest corridors. And then there's like potentially like you have to do multiple environmental assessments between those multiple different agencies. And so this basically cuts that whole DOE, Department of Energy part out of there and just says, FERC, you can decide where it's important and in the national interest to build these big important transmission lines, which will then make it quicker. And the more of these transmission lines we can build, then the more capacity there is to build solar farms and wind farms and clean energy like that. So that's a great thing. We're very excited to see that. It's also got some agreements on how to allocate the costs of these transmission lines, because there's always fights over who's going to pay for how much when this transmission line goes through a lot of different jurisdictions, different counties, different states. And so this basically says you pay proportional to the benefit you get from the electricity from the transmission line. So it'll bypass those fights and make things go a lot quicker in getting these transmission lines agreed upon and built. So that's all good. Transmission stuff, really good in this bill. There's also some renewable energy stuff. It's got a couple of targets for renewable energy on federal lands and waters, doubling the production target for permitting renewables on federal lands, sets a national goal for offshore wind energy production. So that's all good. They're just goals, but still it helps federal agencies to have these goals. So then they can kind of use that as justification for permitting clean energy projects on federal land. And it also does a few things to expedite those permits, telling the agencies like you have to respond to a renewable project application in a timely manner. Also, it sets categorical exclusions for activities that will have low disturbance. So doing things like if you got an existing transmission line, you just want to reconductor it with new technology, or if you've got an area that's already been disturbed and you just want to take that already disturbed area and build a solar farm or a wind farm, things that aren't going to have a significant additional environmental impact, and you can get this categorical exclusion, which then bypasses most of the permitting process and lets it go quicker. So basically, we get targets for more renewables and ways to make them get built faster on federal land. Also very good. There's some technology-specific reforms. You guys might remember when we lobbied for permitting reform in the June conference time, the June lobby days, we talked about technology-specific reforms. So this has a couple of things for geothermal power, which is great because geothermal is this like reliable 24/7 supply of clean energy. But at the moment, permitting for geothermal exploration activities and things like that is very, very, very slow, very onerous. And so this basically says geothermal drilling exploration should be on the same permitting footing as oil and gas exploratory drilling. And so it would give certain geothermal exploratory drilling activities a categorical exclusion for quick permitting to do that. Also, would have us do annual federal land geothermal lease sales. So on federal lands, you do say this is a good spot to do some geothermal projects. We'll do a lease sale on this land so that we can do more of these geothermal projects. So that's all really, really good too. Also, there's some stuff for hydropower projects if they are trying to happen, but they're kind of going over schedule. It extends their timelines basically so they can still keep going even if they're a little slow. So that's all good clean energy stuff. There's a little bit of judicial reform stuff. Basically, right now there is a statute of limitations after the environmental documents have been completed. Then anybody can bring a lawsuit up to 6 years later, which creates a lot of uncertainty for project developers who are trying to build these energy projects. But like you get in the process, and then like 4 years later, somebody brings a lawsuit and grinds it to a halt. And that's just a long time of uncertainty. So this bill would reduce that from 6 years to just 5 months to make it a much briefer window. It's a relatively short window, but at the same time, if somebody like some organization is considering bringing a lawsuit and they get to that 5 month mark and they're not sure, then they can just go ahead and bring the lawsuit and kind of err on the side of caution. So it's not necessarily a bad thing that it's short because people can still bring that lawsuit once they reach that 5 month mark. It also tells courts if there is litigation associated to one of these energy or mineral products to expedite it, kind of make that a priority to get it through the judicial system faster. That's about it for judicial reforms, but that's because this particular committee doesn't have a lot of jurisdiction over judicial reform. The Energy and Natural Resources Committee does, and so we might see some additional permitting reform provisions coming out of that committee at some points that would then potentially combine with this particular bill. So we'll see if that happens. There's also not a lot on community engagement. There's one little thing that it basically says the Department of Interior, when they're looking at renewable energy projects on public lands, they can accept funding from the companies that are proposing those projects to then use that money to improve community engagement, to create some programs to help the communities get involved in the permitting process. That's all there is on community engagement in this bill, but we also did just get some recent rules from the White House Council on Environmental Quality that had a lot of community engagement stuff in there. So that's already been done. So that's kind of good. And then again, we'll see if another committee maybe does some more community engagement provisions that they try to include. But that's all we've gotten here on community engagement at the moment. Then there was a provision related to milling, mining milling, which is basically when you're doing some mining and then you have to do something with the waste or processing the ore or something like that. That's kind of what milling is. And so currently the law says you can't do milling on land that is not part of the mine, on federal land that's not part of the mine. And this bill basically says you can do it on sort of nearby federal land if you need to do something, if you need some space basically nearby to deal with this mining waste. It seems to be aimed specifically at this one mine, actually, called the Rosemont Copper Mine in Arizona. It's basically its permit was denied for this reason because it went to the courts, and the court said you can't do this according to the current law. There's this current like 1872 mining law that says like you have to use the mine itself land and not the adjacent land. And so basically this would change that so that this mine could use like adjacent forest land to deal with the waste from the mine. So this is like it's a controversial thing from an environmental standpoint, whether or not you think that is like a good thing. It's really tricky. It's not really a climate question, it's more of an like local environmental impacts question. The only relation to the climate is that like to build all this clean energy infrastructure and technology that we need to build to make this clean energy transition, we're going to need a lot of copper. And so this is one place you can get the copper. And also currently we get a lot of copper, like the main places that copper comes from are Chile, Peru, the Congo, and China, and then the US is fifth. And so like those places probably have less stringent environmental regulations than the United States. And so if you can get more copper from the United States mines, maybe it has less like overall environmental impact than getting it from other places. But at the same time, there's also questions about like, do we want to be having these adverse impacts to this local forest? So anyway, it's not a straightforward question about like how good or bad this particular provision is. But again, it's not specifically really a climate question. It's more of a local environmental impacts question. So that's a hairy one. Then there's the fossil fuel provisions that are the stuff that most of the questions have related to. So the stuff in there about fossil fuels, like the first thing is that you have to do every year between 2025 and 2029 at least one offshore oil and gas lease sale and also an offshore wind lease sale. So basically give those companies the opportunity to buy that land offshore to do potentially oil and gas and or wind development. There's another one related to liquefied natural gas, LNG export terminals. It basically says, so there's this issue of the Biden administration put a temporary pause on LNG export permits, saying that the Department of Energy should look more closely at their climate impact before approving any more of these permits. And then there's actually a court order that kind of paused that pause, that got rid of the pause. So anyway, basically this bill says like instead of waiting for the DOE to update those assessments or that kind of like the way it looks at the climate impacts, then for any pending liquefied natural gas export terminals that are right now waiting for permitting, the Department of Energy has to use the existing way that they were doing it. So they can't wait until they update those procedures. And then after the Department of Energy finishes its environmental analyses, then it has 90 days to either approve or deny the permit. So we'll talk more about that in a few minutes. There's one other little thing about setting deadline for leasing coal on federal lands, but we don't use a whole lot of coal anymore, so I don't think that's a big deal. An important thing to point out is that this bill is not really touching environmental laws like NEPA. It's just like looking at like the speed at which things are permitted, things like that. So like our bedrock environmental laws are not impacted by this law, which I think is an important thing to bear in mind as well. So let's talk a little more about that LNG provision. So as I mentioned, there was the Biden administration put a pause, trying to give the Department of Energy time to kind of update its climate assessment evaluation process for LNG terminals, because it's really complicated to figure out the climate impact of natural gas exports. But then it actually just a little less than a month ago, a court actually overturned that, and now the Department of Energy is trying to figure out what to do. Do they appeal that court decision? Do they just move forward? Like it's not been figured out what they're going to do next. So right now it's a little bit in limbo. And so like this assessment of like how much climate impact LNG export terminals has is really complicated because it depends on like if you're exporting this liquefied natural gas, it depends on what that would be replacing, which I think I'll talk about here in the next slide. But there was just this analysis done by this person, this group called Simon's Public Affairs. And it was also cited by Bill McKibben. And so a lot of people saw that and were very alarmed because Bill McKibben is a very trusted source for very good reasons. And he was like, this is a terrible thing because this analysis says that it's the equivalent of 165 coal power plants if you go forward and pass this bill. So I think the next slide talks more about that, but that analysis was unfortunately not good. It did some really bad assumptions. Like it was conducted within like a few hours, which kind of tells you it's probably not accurate if it's done that quickly. Yeah, so we'll talk about that here. So, but overall, the question we really want to answer is like, what impact will this bill have on the climate overall? And that's a really tough question to answer, especially like since the bill was just introduced like a week ago. We don't have great answers to these questions yet. But we do know there is this analysis by the energy modelers on the Princeton repeat team that after the Inflation Reduction Act was passed, they looked at like how much difference will it make if we can build transmission lines quickly versus if they are held up by slow permitting. And they found that the difference there between fast and slow transmission build out is like 7% of our emissions. And we're trying to get to 50% cuts. So 7% at a 50% by 2030 is a pretty significant chunk. So we don't know exactly yet how much difference the transmission provisions in this bill will make. I think we've heard that there's analysis coming on that particular question pretty soon. But it's probably going to be a significant chunk. Like those are good transmission provisions. The oil and gas offshore leasing, there was actually similar provisions to this in the Inflation Reduction Act. That was kind of the somewhat controversial, one of the controversial parts of the Inflation Reduction Act was that it had these offshore oil and gas leases. But analyses of that one at the time estimated it was a pretty small impact, only like 0.5% maybe of our 2005 emissions. So like pretty insignificant, relatively speaking, because I mean, offshore oil and gas leases, like, first of all, you're just saying we're going to hold the auction for these leases. And so then the oil and gas companies have to decide, A, if they want to even buy the leases. And then B, if they buy those leases, they then have to decide, do we want to put in the effort into effect to actually develop and drill these particular resources? And they're sitting on a whole bunch of oil and gas leased land that they haven't developed yet. And so just holding an oil and gas offshore lease doesn't necessarily mean it's even going to be like A, purchased or then B, developed. And so given like all the land that oil and gas companies are already sitting on, that's a pretty small effect on overall emissions. The LNG export provisions are more complicated because, as I said, it really depends on what those that the natural gas that is being exported is replacing. Because you put a bunch of natural gas out into the world, and actually most of that is probably going to go to Asia if we build these LNG export facilities. They're going to kind of be in the Gulf, kind of in the southwest part of the country. They're going to go to Asia because that's where most of the demand is. And so, some of it's going to go and it's going to replace coal that would otherwise have been burned. Some of it's going to replace natural gas that would have otherwise been burned. Maybe the natural gas would have come from Russia, which has relatively leaky gas infrastructure. Maybe some of that natural gas will displace, like maybe they would have built some renewable energy instead. So it's really hard to estimate like how much of an emissions impact difference these exports will make because it depends on what would have been burned anyway. So the way I think about it is I think about two different worlds. One world is like if the this bill passes and then these natural gas exports happen, then the natural gas gets burned. But in this other world, if the bill doesn't pass, maybe some of these exports don't happen, and then what would have been burned in this world. And so you have to look at the difference between those worlds. The other thing you have to consider is that, like, even if this bill doesn't pass, maybe those facilities get built anyway because the Department of Energy, to this point, I think has never rejected the permit for a liquefied natural gas export terminal. And so, like, maybe they would change their climate, accounting, and maybe they would reject some of them, but like maybe they wouldn't. Or maybe a new administration comes in and throws out this whole idea to begin with, or like, maybe a court upholds what the current court said, and then so they just have to keep going with the status quo. So there's a lot of kind of like if this, if that, it's hard to do this kind of analysis of what difference it would make. The way this Simon's analysis did it was just to say, like, if the bill is passed, then the pending LNG export terminals will be built. If it's not passed, then the pending ones won't be built. So that's, first of all, not realistic, because if it's not passed, some or all of them will probably still be built. And then the other thing it said was that if the difference there is the amount of natural gas processed in these facilities that are pending, there's 5 pending facilities. All of that gas, all of the greenhouse gas emissions, we're just going to add that to the atmosphere and call that it's their climate impact. But again, in reality, like, we're not just adding this natural gas to a status quo world. We are taking this natural gas and displacing some other kind of energy, coal, gas, renewables, whatever it might be. And so you can't just like say that this natural gas is all added to the atmosphere. You have to say it's added to the atmosphere, but it's replacing these other greenhouse gas emissions from these other sources that wouldn't be added to the atmosphere. And so again, it's like a very complicated thing to do, but it's this particular analysis by Simons is just like grossly oversimplified, and the number is just not reliable. To get reliable numbers, 2 really good groups, RFF and RMI, we here are working on modeling the impacts of this bill on overall emissions. So hopefully within a few weeks, we'll have some better answers from some careful analysis. And I would expect, based on what I've said so far, we expect that it will have a net positive impact on reducing emissions, but we'll have to wait and see, wait for some good analysis to see what those effects will be. So let's talk about who's for and who's against the bill. The lists are getting quite long. They are in the forum, and we'll put them in the FAQs as well. But among climate groups, of course, CCL, also the Nature Conservancy are for it. Also, some of our climate hawk allies in the Senate, Senators Hickenlooper and Heinrich, have come out strongly in support of the bill. A lot of clean energy groups, solar, renewable energy, clean power, fervo geothermal energy, like all these groups that are trying to build clean energy are for the bill. Lots of grid experts, because the transmission stuff, are for the bill as well. There's various like bipartisan groups that work on energy and climate policies. Progressive Policy Institute, Bipartisan Policy Center, Third Way, American Conservative Coalition, Chamber of Commerce is for it, R Street Institute's for it. A lot of our allies on other policies like carbon pricing are also for this bill. A lot of electrical workers and mineral groups because of the mining provisions and the grid provisions. Lots of those organizations are also come out in favor of the bill. Also, got to note, fossil fuel groups, there are quite a few of those who have come out in favor of the bill because of those oil and gas provisions. Like, they like to see the LNG exports. They like to see the oil and gas offshore leasing. So even though like clean energy will also benefit, like they see some direct benefit. And so they are also, many fossil fuel groups are also in support of the bill. And then against the bill, there are a number of environmental groups. Many of them, I think they just don't like giving the fossil fuel industry any kind of benefit, even if like maybe the net benefit might be positive, or maybe they think the net benefit will, or the net impact they might think will be negative based on, for example, that Simon's very rough analysis that I just mentioned. So for For those reasons, there are some groups that are against the bill, although this is a much shorter list of groups than those who are in favor of the bill. Although they certainly have some of our allies on here, like Bill McKibben, as I mentioned, Sierra Club 350, and so forth. So it's not straightforward, but those are kind of the reasons that they're against the bill. But I think we need to keep the overall perspective here in mind. I think a lot of those groups are really focusing on the supply side of the issue because, like, I mean, the climate movement kind of like grew up and matured by trying to block fossil fuel infrastructure projects like the Keystone XL pipeline, the Dakota Access pipeline, things like that. Like, this is where like blocking these pipelines is where a lot of groups and a lot of people really got engaged in climate policies and climate advocacy. But we're to a point where like blocking fossil fuels is not enough to solve the problem. Another thing to bear in mind is like we can't just suddenly shut off the valve of fossil fuels. Like we still people have cars that need gasoline. We have infrastructure that needs natural gas. Like we still do need some fossil fuels, and so we're going to need like there is going to have to be some continued oil and gas drilling, whether we like it or not. But we're trying to minimize and reduce that amount of fossil fuels that we need by building more clean energy infrastructure so that we can get our energy more and more from those clean sources. As I put it on the forum, we would like to bury fossil fuels in an avalanche of clean technologies. So to do that, we have to pass bills like this that are compromised, but that will help us build that clean energy infrastructure faster. And those bipartisan bills like that require compromise. And so the key question for us is like, what is the net climate impact of this bill? And I think from our initial analysis, we're pretty confident it's going to be a positive impact in terms of reducing emissions. Oops. Also, along those lines, I was just looking today at this analysis by this group, Rystad Energy, that was talking about like are basically oil companies have stopped increasing their annual oil output, and like this analysis from Rice Energy was saying like we don't really have enough oil if we don't start to transition to electric vehicles at this point, because basically oil companies are anticipating that we're going to transition. It's already happening. We're already transitioning to electric vehicles. So the way they put it was attempts to limit the supply of oil will have hardly any effect on limiting global warming. Instead, the only feasible way of keeping global temperatures from rising less than 2 degrees is to ensure fast electrification of road transportation. So they're saying like you can't just try to solve the problem by limiting the supply. You have to address the demand by transitioning to clean alternatives, which is what we're trying to do with permitting reform. And then it's also worth bearing in mind that our past bipartisan legislation that we passed and even partisan legislation often has to have compromises. So the Inflation Reduction Act I mentioned had a similar provision that had oil and gas leases that were kind of tied to renewable leases. In Senator Manchin's first proposed permitting reform bill, he had, I'm sure everybody remembers, the Mountain Valley Pipeline was kind of the poison pill that was in there. And so like a lot of people didn't support the bill for that reason. And then what happened? We didn't get the transmission stuff. We got the Mountain Valley Pipeline anyway. And so, like, if you're like potentially going to get these fossil fuel infrastructure happening anyway, like you at least should try to get something for it, like this transmission stuff, this clean energy stuff. Like, you don't want to let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Like, sometimes you have to accept a little bit of fossil fuel stuff in order to get lots of clean energy stuff, lots of transmission stuff to accelerate this transition to clean alternatives so that we can reduce the demand for those fossil fuels. And so then like those oil and gas leases, they just never get used because there's not enough demand for them. Or like other countries, they see like the price of solar and wind going down even faster because we're deploying so much of it that maybe they don't use all that exported LNG. Maybe they build more geothermal and solar and wind on their land as well. And then another question we've gotten is like, why don't we wait until we get these like analyses from RFF and RMI before CCL endorses the bill and takes action? And the issue there is that they decided to schedule this committee vote very soon. It's like a 9-day transition from bill introduction to committee vote, which the committee vote is happening this Wednesday. We want to keep the bill progressing forward. Like we don't want it to fail this committee vote because then that really would just like get us stuck in the mud a little bit. So we want it to pass this committee vote. because we think it is a good bill. And it's important to bear in mind that this is just a committee vote. Like, this is not the final vote. This is not what the final bill is going to look like. There's still going to be more negotiations before it comes to the floor for an eventual vote. And, again, there could still be more provisions coming out of a different committee. Maybe the House does something. Peters and Westerman are talking about doing something. We'll see. Maybe they'll just accept the Senate version, but maybe they'll be involved in negotiations. There's still going to be more stuff happening. This is not the final bill. The final bill maybe will happen in the lame duck, which is like late November to December of this year, if it happens this year. Depending on what happens in the election, it could get kicked to next year. We don't know. But like the earliest it's going to happen is like end of November into December. So there's still a lot of time before the final bill and a lot of time to negotiate things and so on and so forth. But we want to make sure it keeps moving forward so that we can have those negotiations and it doesn't just get stuck by a failed committee vote. So that's why, because of this short timeline, which I wish they'd given us a longer timeline to put together these slides and learn about this bill, but that's the world we live in. Like, they like to take forever to do anything, and then all of a sudden, once they do something, it's lightning speed. We saw that with the Inflation Reduction Act too, so we're just rolling with the punches. And there's this good article in Heat Map that I think phrased it the right way. This is the best permitting reform deal we're probably going to get. Like, it is a compromise, but like, there's a lot of good stuff in there. On net, we think it's good. And so, like, there's good reason to support it.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Citizens Climate Lobby's training program. You can tune into more episodes anywhere podcasts are available. Inspired by what you heard today? Join Citizens Climate Lobby to advocate for bipartisan climate solutions. Go to community.citizensclimate.org to find more trainings, resources, your local chapter, national action teams, discussion forums, and more. Be sure to like our Facebook page and follow us on Twitter and Instagram @CitizensClimate. We also invite all of our listeners to subscribe to our YouTube channel for more inspiration. Like what you hear? Recommend us to your friends and make sure to give us a 5-star rating. It helps us show up on other listeners' feeds. Feel free to pass on any suggestions for future episodes in the comments as well. And together, we are creating the political will for a livable world.